Some rain in Seattle doesn't fall. It just hangs in the air, cold and patient, waiting for someone to walk into it. At the hour before the city has learned to breathe again, when the street lamps still burn but the sky has already started to change color, August Whitlock stepped out of a black car parked at the gate of Terminal 18. At this port, nobody used his name. People simply said him, and everyone knew who was meant. He had come to look, with his own eyes, at the thing that was killing his empire. 4 shipments ruined, 3 engineering teams defeated, and folded in his coat pocket was a suspension notice. A thin sheet of paper capable of collapsing 3 generations of the Whitlock name. Then he heard the wheels. A cart piled with scrap paper caught its edge in a drainage groove a few steps away. It leaned, hesitated for a single beat, and went over. Paper spilled across the wet asphalt, white and weightless, drifting off in the running water like a flock of birds brought down mid-flight. The woman pulling that cart froze for half a second, and then she lunged. But August did not understand she wasn't lunging for the paper. She let it go. She stepped straight through it, dropped to her knees in the standing water, and closed both hands around one single thing. A stiff plastic folder wrapped in overlapping strips of tape, smaller than a newspaper, worth not 1 cent at any recycling station in this city. She pressed it against her chest, curved her body over it to shield it from the rain, while an entire morning's earnings washed down the storm drain behind her. August Whitlock had spent 34 years among men who only ever protected what could be priced. He had never once seen anyone choose like that. He walked toward her. She stood up and took a step back, not frightened, only watchful. The particular watchfulness of someone who has learned that when a man walks toward you, it is rarely good news. But the water had already seeped into the folder's edge. The plastic gaped open, and in the dull yellow of the dock lights, August saw what was inside. Not identification papers, not a family photograph, not money. It was a technical drawing, drawn by hand, mechanical pencil, lines clean as print, drawn to scale, fully annotated, using industry-standard notation that only formal training ever teaches a person to use, and across the top, in careful block capitals, was a line that made August Whitlock forget how to breathe. Terminal 18 Cold Bay B4 compressor cycle misalignment, the very warehouse standing behind him. The very failure that 3 engineering teams, paid $400,000 a year, had not found in 6 weeks. Drawn by a woman standing soaked in the rain, with everything she owned in the world lying in an overturned cart. He asked her what she did for a living. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she answered, in a voice so level he could not find a single trace of self-pity in it. "I collect paper." She was lying. And she was telling the absolute truth. What neither of them knew, standing there in that rain, was that 11 months earlier she had already come to knock on this door. Not once. And all that remained of those 4 attempts were 4 lines in a security guard's logbook, 4 lines that, when August Whitlock finally read them, would make him understand that he had not lost $31 million because nobody knew how to fix it. He had lost it because the answer had stood outside his gate 4 separate times, and not one person had opened the door. If this story has sparked your curiosity, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, so we can continue exploring the stories still waiting ahead together. 3 hours before the rain touched the pavement of Terminal 18, the lights were still burning on the 22nd floor of the Whitlock Marine Building, and in the room at the end of the corridor, a man named Harlan Voss sat with both hands resting on his knees like a man waiting to hear his sentence. He owed 3 months in docking fees. He had spent an entire week rehearsing the words he would use to ask for an extension. And he had brought a thick envelope with him, which he placed on the walnut desk and gently pushed forward with his fingertips. The gesture of a man who believed cash was a language everyone understood. August Whitlock didn't look at the envelope. He looked at Harlan Voss for so long that the other man began to hear the heating system running inside the walls. Then he picked up the desk phone, pressed 3 extension numbers, and spoke a single sentence. "Container 4471. Hold it." He set the receiver down. He didn't raise his voice. There wasn't even the slightest trace of anger in it, and that was precisely what made it so frightening. "This port doesn't provide free storage," he said. "Your cargo will remain there until you remember when the payment was due. Every morning, you still haven't remembered, I'll add another charge." Harlan Voss opened his mouth as if he meant to say something. Then he looked into August's eyes and swallowed the words. He picked up the envelope, rose to his feet, and walked toward the door with his hands trembling so badly that he had to clasp them tightly against his chest to hide it. The door closed with barely a sound. Delphine Okonjo entered through the side door, carrying a thin folder in her arms. She had stood in the corridor throughout the meeting, and in the 19 years she had worked under the Whitlock family, she had learned that there were moments when it was best to let silence flow through the room before speaking. She placed the folder on the desk and turned to face him. "The 4th shipment," she said. "The entire B4 compartment." The temperature drifted during the night, while the monitoring system reported normal readings the entire time. By the time the door was opened, it was already too late. August opened the folder. The first page contained a table of figures. The second held photographs of the refrigerated compartment's interior, showing packages arranged in perfectly straight rows, outwardly intact and utterly worthless. 3 engineering teams, Delphine said. Our internal team admitted defeat during the second week. The consulting firm from Chicago flew in, stayed for 9 days, then sent us an invoice and a report saying the fault was in the control software. The German team was more careful. They measured every section of piping again, replaced 2 circuit boards, and then said the same thing in a more courteous way. None of them found anything at all. She pulled a single sheet of paper from the bottom of the folder and placed it on top of everything else. This arrived this afternoon. August looked down. It was a letter from the regulatory agency. 3 paragraphs, 1 signature, and between them stood the phrase that would keep every one of his lawyers awake through the night. Conditional suspension of the pharmaceutical storage license. 3 generations of Whitlocks had held this port. His grandfather had held it with things that were never entered into any ledger. His father had held it another way, cleaner on the surface, though August had never wanted to know what lay underneath. August held it with something neither of those men had possessed, a lawful license that allowed everything passing through this place to look like ordinary cargo belonging to an ordinary company. If that document was lost, the cover would fall away, and once the cover was gone, whatever stood exposed would no longer be his concern alone. He folded the letter in half and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. "Do you want me to call anyone else?" Delphine asked. August didn't answer at once. He rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the black harbor water, where the cranes stood motionless like a row of leafless trees. "I'll go down there tomorrow morning," he said. "I want to see it for myself." Delphine nodded and left the room. She didn't ask a second time, and it wasn't because she had no questions. There was an unwritten rule at this port, one that no one ever put on paper and no one ever taught to newcomers. Yet anyone who worked there longer than 6 months inevitably learned it on their own. Mr. Whitlock asked only once. Anyone who made him ask a second time understood that they wouldn't be there much longer. The room fell silent. On the wall behind his desk, exactly 3 steps from his chair, hung a clock with a round face, a dark wooden frame, and glass without a single scratch. The hour hand was still there. The second hand was still there, moving steadily beneath the glass, 1 measured beat at a time. The minute hand wasn't. Someone had removed it a very long time ago, and no one in this building had ever asked why. The black car was gone, and the road outside Terminal 18 had returned to exactly what it always was at that hour. Wet, empty, and indifferent to everyone. Marlowe Brennan remained still for a little while longer, the plastic folder pressed tightly against her chest, until she was certain the man had truly left. Then she slipped the folder beneath her coat, pulled the zipper all the way up to her chin, and turned back to the wreckage of her morning. Most of the paper had already washed away. She didn't stand there watching it go. She bent down and began gathering what remained, 1 sheet at a time, neither hurried nor angry. If a sheet was still firm, she gave it a sharp shake to scatter the water, then pressed it into her palm. If it had already gone soft, she kept it anyway, because wet paper could still be weighed, though the recycling station would deduct part of its value, and she needed to know beforehand exactly how much they would deduct so she could argue with them. She stacked the white paper separately from the cardboard, not for the sake of neatness, but because the 2 materials fetched different prices, something buyers had a habit of forgetting whenever the person delivering the load looked like her. Once she had set the cart upright again and finished loading it, she reached into her coat and pulled out the first of the 2 objects she had carried with her for the past 11 months, a handheld steel spring scale with a faded dial and a hook at the bottom that had bent slightly from being pulled too many times. She fastened it to the strap of the sack, lifted it with 1 hand, read the number, then lowered it again. After that, she took out the second object, a small hardcover notebook wrapped in an extra layer of cloudy plastic, and wrote in it with the steady pencil strokes of someone who had once been taught how to print letters on blueprints, the morning's weight, the type of paper, and the price posted at the station the day before. Only then did she leave. The way back wasn't long. It merely curved behind the warehouse district, followed the chain-link fence, passed an entire row of windowless concrete walls, and ended in the narrow space between two walls behind the transformer station at Terminal 18. The space was just wide enough for one person to lie on their side, with a corrugated metal overhang that kept out most of the rain, and more important than anything else, it was warm. There wasn't another warm place within a few hundred yards. Heat from the system inside seeped through the concrete, low and constant, never shutting off. And Marlo had discovered this place on the third night after leaving her last apartment, wandering with both hands pressed against the walls like a blind woman searching for her way. She pulled down the sheet of cardboard she used as bedding, positioned the cart near her head to block the wind, then lay down with her back against the wall. That was how she slept every night, not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only position that kept her entire back pressed against the concrete. And when her back rested against it, she listened, not with her ears. Her ears could hear only the rain tapping against the metal roof and the horns of ships out in the bay. She listened through her spine, through the way a deep vibration traveled across the concrete and passed directly into her body. 3 short pulses, a pause, then 3 more. The compressor started. The compressor stopped. The compressor started again. After 11 months of lying there, she had learned the breathing rhythm of that warehouse in a way no data sheet could ever record. Learned it so thoroughly that she could drift into sleep midway through a cycle and still awaken with a start when one pulse came in the wrong place. Tonight, it was wrong again. The pause was shorter than it should have been. She lay perfectly still, counting silently, waiting for the next cycle to make certain, and the next cycle was wrong in exactly the same way. She opened her eyes and stared up at the dark metal above her head. Then she slipped a hand beneath her coat, pulled out the notebook and the pencil stub, turned to the last page, and added another line beneath all the others, the 300-and-somethingth entry since the day she had begun counting. She wasn't writing for anyone. No one had ever read it. She wrote because it was the only thing left of the person she had once been. Sunday was the only day of the week when Marlo didn't collect paper, and it was also the only day she woke without having to listen to the wall. She walked to the stop in Sodu, took the first bus downtown, waited for the second beneath the shelter at the transit station, then transferred to a third heading south, and throughout the entire journey, she sat beside the window with both hands resting on her knees, keeping them perfectly clean. She had washed her hands 3 times before leaving home, scrubbing beneath every fingernail with a piece of an old brush, because there were things she couldn't control and things she could, and the hands that touched her daughter were among the very few things that belonged to the second kind. The park was 2 blocks from the final stop, with a large oak tree, a gently sloping lawn, and in the middle, a yellow slide faded pale along the handrails. Marlo had barely stepped through the gate when she heard the call, the voice she would have recognized in the middle of a crowded airport, and then Junie came flying down the slide and raced across the grass with both arms stretched straight toward the sky as though she were trying to fly, crashing into her mother's legs and holding on tightly. Marlo knelt and wrapped her arms around her daughter, and in that moment she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, just briefly enough that no one had time to notice. Junie didn't close her eyes. She had begun talking while she was still 10 steps away and had no intention of stopping. She pulled a sheet of paper folded into quarters from her coat pocket, opened it with both hands in the solemn manner of a 6-year-old presenting a work of great importance, and held it up before her mother. On it was a very tall building, so tall that its roof touched the edge of the page and had to be folded over, drawn in gray crayon, with square windows arranged in perfectly even rows from bottom to top. Inside one of those windows near the top stood a tiny blonde figure with one hand raised. "That's you, Mommy," Junie said, pointing to the figure with her index finger. "I drew you on the highest floor because you can see the farthest from there." Marlo took the drawing in both hands and told her daughter that it was beautiful, far more beautiful than she had imagined. Junie nodded as though this were an obvious fact that required no further discussion, then immediately moved on to another subject, because in the mind of a 6-year-old, every subject rested beside every other one, and none was more important than the rest. Aunt Thea's cat had learned how to open the refrigerator, she explained. Not all the way, just a crack, but Aunt Thea had been forced to tie it shut with a rubber band, and now the cat sat staring at that rubber band for a very long time every evening. She went on to explain that the cat's name was Sandwich because when it first arrived, its fur was the color of toasted bread crust, and that it slept on her feet every night and was heavier than anyone would think. Marlo listened to every word, asked questions in all the right places, and laughed exactly when she was meant to laugh. Then mother and daughter climbed the slide, came down the slide, and walked around the oak tree 3 times because Junie wanted to count how many acorns had fallen, only to reach 20-something before forgetting what she had been counting. Thea Brennan stood some distance away near the bench beneath the shade of the tree. She didn't come closer or call out. She simply stood there with her arms folded across her chest, watching the lawn. Only when the sun cast long shadows and it was time to leave did she approach, and she didn't say anything. She merely pressed a sealed plastic container of still warm rice into her niece's hand, its lid secured with an extra rubber band, then gave Marlowe's arm a single, gentle pat. Junie hugged her mother once more at the park gate, told her to take good care of the drawing and not let it get wrinkled, then ran toward her aunt with her shoes clattering against the sidewalk before turning back to wave twice. Marlowe waved back both times. She boarded the bus, chose a seat beside the window, and kept the smile on her face as she climbed the steps, paid her fare, walked down the narrow aisle, and sat. She was still smiling when the engine started. She was still smiling when the folding doors closed. Only after the wheels had carried her some distance away and the park had completely disappeared behind the row of buildings did she turn her face toward the window, and only then did she no longer have to smile. That night, August Whitlock didn't sleep, and sleepless nights were nothing new in his life. But the reason was, he sat in his office with the door closed, the computer screen the only source of light in the room, and on it played footage from a camera mounted on a lamppost outside the gate of Terminal 18. The image quality was poor. Rain blurred the lens, the harbor lights washed everything in a murky yellow, and the woman in the frame was little more than a dark shape moving from left to right. He rewound the footage. The cart tilted, hesitated, then toppled over. He rewound it again. He wasn't looking at her face, because no matter how slowly he played it, that face remained nothing more than a blur beneath the hood. He wasn't looking at her clothes, her shoes, or the cart. He was looking at something else. Something that 34 years spent among men who knew how to put a price on everything had taught him to recognize instantly order. In the brief span between the moment the cart overturned and the moment she dropped to her knees, the woman had made a decision, and that decision had been carried out before she'd even had time to think. She hadn't hesitated between 2 choices. She hadn't glanced toward the papers drifting away before turning from them. She had ignored them completely, as though they had never existed, and gone straight to the only thing she needed to save. August had sat in enough conference rooms to know that when people were forced into a moment that left no time for calculation, whatever they reached for was what they truly valued, and everything they said afterward was merely decoration. He had watched men sign contracts in the voice of a philanthropist, then drain money from a joint account at midnight 3 months later. He had watched a man he once called his mentor set a cigar box back on the table and walk out the door. He had never seen anyone, in any room or at any level of wealth, face an immediate choice like that and choose the thing that wasn't worth a single cent. He replayed the footage a 4th time, froze it at the precise second she fell to her knees, and sat staring at the image for a very long time. Beyond the window, the sky was gradually brightening. The rain had eased, and somewhere below, the city was beginning to move. He picked up the phone and called Delphine Okonjo. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice already fully alert, because in 19 years, she had never once made him wait for a 3rd. "I need you to find someone," he said. "The woman outside the gate this morning, the one with the cart. I want to know who she is, where she lives, and what she did before she began doing whatever she does now." Delphine didn't respond immediately. She remained silent for exactly 1 beat, the kind of silence that belonged to someone deciding whether a question should be asked. And then she asked it. "What do you want me to find her for?" "If this is about making a donation, the communications department already has a procedure in place. We do it twice a year, and they'll handle everything. If this is about hiring her, I need to know what position you have in mind so I can open a file." August looked at the frozen image on the screen before him. "I'm doing neither," he said. "I don't go around handing people money so I can sleep better at night, and I haven't promised anyone a job." He paused. "I have 3 engineering teams. I pay them more than most people in this city will earn in a lifetime. They have data, equipment, and everything money can buy, and after 6 weeks, they still haven't found anything. This morning, a woman with nothing stood outside my gate holding the answer in her hands. I want to know how that happened." Silence lingered on the other end of the line for another moment. Then Delphine said she understood, and that she would begin with the recycling stations in Sodo, because the paper had to be sold somewhere, and wherever there were scales, there would be records. He set down the receiver. On the wall behind him, The second hand continued moving steadily past the marks it no longer had anyone beside it to follow. It took Delphine Okonjo less than 2 days to find her, and she found her not by asking questions, but by waiting. The recycling station stood at the end of a dead-end road in Sodu, between a truck repair shop and a yard filled with old tires, and Delphine had parked there early that morning, sitting behind the wheel with a cup of coffee slowly growing cold on the dashboard as she watched people come and go. Around mid-morning, the familiar cart appeared at the far end of the road. Delphine didn't get out immediately. She watched the woman push her load into the weighing area, watched her arrange the sacks by type on the concrete floor, and decided she would wait until the work was finished before approaching her. But the work wasn't finished. An exchange began at the weighing counter, quiet at first, then gradually loud enough to be heard from outside the yard. The buyer was a middle-aged man, wearing a canvas apron and holding a clipboard, and he was shaking his head in the manner of someone who had shaken it the same way 1,000 times and knew with certainty that this time would end no differently. "The scale is the scale," he said. "I pay whatever number it shows. If you want to argue, take your load somewhere else tomorrow." Delphine opened the car door and moved closer, stopping at just the right distance to hear. The woman didn't raise her voice. That was the first thing Delphine noticed. She showed no anger, offered no complaints, and made no appeal based on her circumstances. She simply reached inside her coat, pulled out a small notebook wrapped in a plastic bag that had turned cloudy with age, flipped through several pages with her thumb, and began to read. Last Monday, white paper, 46.3 pounds, at this station's own posted rate that day. Last Thursday, the same type, 40.8 pounds. This Tuesday, 41.9 pounds. She continued reading, neither quickly nor hesitantly, her voice as steady as though she were presenting a table of figures before some kind of review board. Then she looked up. "For 3 weeks in a row, your scale has weighed an average of nearly 3 1/3 pounds less than my hand scale each time, and the discrepancy isn't random. It always goes in the same direction. A broken scale gives errors both ways. This one is only wrong in one direction. You decide what I'm supposed to make of that." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at the notebook in her hand, at the pages filled with pencil marks arranged in perfectly straight columns, and something changed in his eyes. It wasn't remorse, but calculation. The calculation of a man who had just realized that the person standing before him had been recording everything for an entire month without his knowledge. He didn't apologize. He merely lowered his eyes to the clipboard, crossed out one line, wrote another figure over it, then opened a drawer and counted out more money onto the counter. The woman picked up the money, counted it once, slipped it into an inside pocket, closed the notebook, and tucked it back beneath her coat. She thanked him. She actually said thank you. And Delphine stood there, thinking that in 19 years of working beside the most powerful people on this coast, she had never seen anyone win an argument and then thank the person who had lost it. She approached as the woman was pulling her empty cart out of the yard. Delphine introduced herself, named the company she represented, and said that someone wanted to speak with her about the drawing inside the plastic folder. Marlo Brennan stopped. She looked Delphine over from head to toe, then glanced past her shoulder toward the black car parked at the entrance to the dead-end road. She didn't seem surprised, but she didn't seem pleased either. "Thank you," she said, "but I'm not going." Delphine asked why. The answer came slowly, and when it did, it was perfectly calm. "The last time I walked into a building like that, I carried exactly what I'm carrying now," she said. "I gave a 40-minute presentation. They thanked me, told me to sit and wait, and 2 weeks later, I received a letter saying the company was restructuring. I've spent 3 years sending applications everywhere. No one has called me back. It isn't because they didn't read them. It's because they did." She pulled the cart onto the sidewalk. "So forgive me, but I have nothing left to lose, and I'm not climbing another tall building just so I can fall a second time." Delphine didn't try to persuade her. She had stood beside August Whitlock long enough to know that some people retreated farther the harder they were pushed, and this woman was one of them. She simply took a business card from her pocket, held it out between 2 fingers, and kept her hand there until Marlo accepted it. "I'm not asking you for an answer today," she said, "but I'll tell you one thing, and then I'll leave. If you're right, that place is losing $31 million, and they still don't know why. If you're wrong, you won't have lost anything tomorrow that you haven't already lost today." She turned and walked back toward the car. Marlo remained standing in the middle of the dead-end road with the business card in her hand, and she didn't throw it away. She called on Wednesday afternoon, and she called not because she had changed her mind, but because the night before, The wall had fallen out of rhythm once again, and she had lain there, thinking about $31 million, slipping through a hole, whose location only she knew. Delphine met her in the lobby. The elevator climbed 22 floors in less than a minute, and during that entire time, Marlo Brennan didn't look at the mirrored wall once. She knew what she looked like. Her gray wool coat was 2 sizes too large, its shoulders sagging, both elbows worn through to the lining, and she had patched them with the only thread she owned, a spool of dark brown thread that didn't match the fabric, but the stitches were perfectly straight, every one the same length, every space between them equal, the kind of stitching a person could only achieve after sitting beneath a streetlight for hours with nowhere else to be, and nothing demanding haste. The doors opened onto a carpeted hallway, and Delphine led her to the far end, into a conference room with a long table of dark wood and a glass wall extending from floor to ceiling. There were 11 people in the room. Every one of them wore a suit. Every one of them looked up at the same moment when she entered, and then every one of them made the same small movement without realizing it, lowering their eyes to her coat before lifting them again. August Whitlock sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. Delphine indicated a place for her to stand at the opposite end, beside the projection screen, and Marlo set the plastic folder on the wooden surface. The first person to speak was a man seated along the left side, his hair neatly combed, cufflinks fastened at his wrists, carrying himself like someone accustomed to having an entire conference room wait until he had finished before anyone else began. Corbin Ashgrove, head of engineering. He didn't greet her. He asked immediately, in a pleasant, almost friendly voice, where she had earned her degree. Marlo answered. She gave the name of the school, her field of study, and the year she graduated, without adding a single word. Corbin nodded slowly, as though he had just heard an interesting answer, then pulled his laptop closer and began typing. The sound of the keyboard was very clear in the silent room. He typed her name. He made no attempt to conceal what he was doing, didn't turn the screen away, and when the results appeared, he began to read. He read aloud, clearly and deliberately, so that all 11 people in the room could hear. He read the name of a biomedical equipment company in Portland. He read the words termination of employment. He read the civil case number, the plaintiff's name, the outcome, and the date the court issued its ruling. Then he looked up and said, in the same pleasant voice he had used from the beginning, that according to everything he could find, there had been no record of her working anywhere in the 3 years since that date. Then he asked the room, not her, whether anyone there believed it made sense for them to stop their work and listen to someone with a record like hers, explain a system worth however many millions of dollars. No one answered. Someone looked down at the documents in front of them. Someone else turned their eyes away. Not one person said a word, and that silence was heavier than anything Corbin had just said. Marlo didn't respond. She turned her head and looked through the glass wall behind the seated figures. From that height, the entire harbor lay below. The bay stretched out in the color of steel, and the square windows of the building across from them rose in perfectly even rows from bottom to top. She was standing near the summit of a very tall building. She reached out and lifted the plastic folder from the table, holding it with both hands in the way a person holds something that has been soaked and dried again many times. It's nothing, she said, her voice calm, neither louder nor softer than the voice she had used when naming her school moments earlier. Then she turned and walked toward the door. She took 4 steps. On the 5th, a chair slid backward at the far end of the table, and August Whitlock rose to his feet. He didn't call her name. He walked around the end of the table at a measured pace and stopped between her and the door, not completely blocking her path, merely standing there, while the room behind him fell utterly still because no one had seen him leave that chair during any meeting in the past 6 weeks. He didn't ask how much money she wanted. He didn't ask what evidence she had. Didn't ask who had allowed her inside, and didn't say a word about the record that had just been read aloud before 11 people. He looked directly at her and asked only one question. How did you hear it? Marlo stood motionless with the plastic folder pressed against her chest. Over the past 3 years, many people had asked her many questions. They had asked why she had filed the lawsuit, how she intended to survive, whether she planned to return home, and whether she had tried applying anywhere yet. No one had ever asked her that question. She looked at the man standing before her, the man whom everyone in the harbor referred to by everything but his name, and after a silence long enough for everyone in the room to hear the air conditioning running above them, she said, "Let me borrow your elevator, and I'll show you." No one in that conference room imagined that what they were about to do was walk. Marlowe didn't present a single page of documentation, didn't open the plastic folder, and didn't ask permission to use the projection screen. She walked straight into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. And 11 people in suits had no choice but to follow her, some still clutching entire stacks of files because they hadn't had time to think of where to put them. A company car took them to the harbor. From the parking lot, she led the entire group on foot, around the back of the warehouse complex, along the chain-link fence, and past a long stretch of windowless concrete walls. No one spoke throughout the walk. There was only the sound of leather shoes striking wet pavement, and someone behind them muttering a question about how much farther they had to go. She stopped in a narrow space between two walls behind the electrical substation. Corbin Ashgrove looked around, taking in the sheet of cardboard spread across the ground and the blue tarp folded neatly in one corner, and he couldn't hide the expression on his face. Marlowe concealed nothing either. She simply pointed to the cardboard and said, "I sleep here." Then she continued, "Stand close to the wall, place your hands against it, and be quiet." For a moment, no one moved. The kind of moment in which 11 educated men waited for someone else to go first. August Whitlock stepped forward and placed his palm against the wall. Then the others followed. Marlowe knelt, pressed her forearm and shoulder against the concrete, closed her eyes, and began counting aloud. She counted slowly and evenly, her voice low. When she reached a certain number, she said, "Now," and at that exact moment a deep vibration passed through the wall, brief and distinct, strong enough for every hand resting there to feel it. She continued counting. Once again, she said, "Now." And once again, it came exactly when she said it would. She did this 4 times in succession without being wrong once, and by the 4th time, no one was moving anymore. "It starts again sooner than it should," she said, still pressed against the wall. "Not by much, only a few seconds. But it does that 36 times every hour, and it has been doing it for the past 11 months. She rose, brushed her hands against the hem of her coat, and for the first time since leaving the conference room, opened the plastic folder. The drawing inside was dry, its edges slightly curled. She held it up and pointed to one spot. "The compressor doesn't start early on its own," she said. "It starts because something tells it that the pressure has dropped, and the thing telling it that is the pressure sensor on the return line. That sensor isn't broken. It's simply in the wrong place." She traced her finger along a section of pencil line. "According to the construction drawing, it should be 4 inches from the relief valve. The one inside your warehouse is 11 inches from the valve. At that distance, every time the relief valve opens, the passing airflow creates a localized pressure dip directly at the sensing point. The sensor detects that dip and reports that the entire system is losing pressure. The controller believes it and switches the compressor on sooner than necessary. The controller isn't wrong. The software isn't wrong. Both are doing exactly what they were told to do. The problem is that for the past 11 months, they've been taking instructions from a device installed in the wrong location, and no one has gone to check because the construction drawing is correct, while what's inside the warehouse doesn't match the drawing." Corbin Ashgrove took his hand away from the wall. He said it was an interesting hypothesis, placing a slight emphasis on the word hypothesis. He continued by saying that over the past 6 weeks, they had extracted the complete operating logs and submitted them to 2 independent firms for analysis, and there was no data whatsoever showing that the compressor cycle was out of phase in the manner she had just described. He asked whether she had any figures, any measurement reports, anything at all besides a wall and a pencil drawing. Marlowe closed the plastic folder and slipped it inside her coat. She looked at Corbin, and when she answered, she neither raised her voice nor took a single second to think. "You read its data," she said. "I sleep beside it." No one responded to that. Wind from the bay swept through the narrow space between the 2 walls, and 11 men in suits stood motionless in that concrete alley, each still carrying in the palm of his hand the sensation of a vibration that, until 30 minutes earlier, he had believed didn't exist. August Whitlock was the last to lower his hand. He said nothing to Corbin. He merely turned to Delphine and told her to call the maintenance team, open Bay B4, and bring a measuring tape. The maintenance team opened Bay B4 late that afternoon, and the man holding the measuring tape was a mechanic who had worked at that harbor for 14 years. He crawled into the narrow space behind the valve assembly, took the measurement, crawled back out, then went in and measured it again because he couldn't believe the number he had just read. 11 inches, he said, in the voice of a man who had just discovered that the door to his own home had been left open for an entire year without anyone noticing. No one among those standing there said another word. Corbin Ashgrove was the first to leave the cold storage bay. That night, Delphine Okonjo stayed late at the office, and she didn't stay because of the censor. One detail from that afternoon had lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave, the way that woman had moved through the harbor without asking for directions even once, turning exactly where she needed to turn and stopping exactly where she needed to stop. Delphine had worked there for 19 years, and she knew that strangers didn't move through the place that way. So she opened the archives, took out the duty logs from the security booth at the main gate, and began working backward from the most recent month. She found the first entry close to midnight. She found the second 10 minutes later. By the time she stopped, 4 logbooks lay open before her, each turned to a different page from a different month, and on all 4 pages was a handwritten entry so similar that she had to read them again to make sure her eyes weren't deceiving her. The next morning, she carried all 4 books to the 22nd floor and placed them on August Whitlock's desk, already open to the correct pages. He didn't ask what they were. He bent over and read. The first entry, written more than 10 months earlier, stated that a woman had come to the gate asking to see the engineering department, carrying a stack of papers inside a plastic folder and having no appointment. Beneath it, in the same handwriting, was the conclusion. Vagrant. Asked to leave the premises. The second entry was from nearly 8 months earlier, during a different shift, and written by a different person. The same account. The same conclusion. The third had been written 6 months earlier. The fourth, more than 3 months earlier, when the first shipment had already failed, and everyone in that building had begun holding daily meetings about it, 4 times, 4 different people. 4 nearly identical entries written by 4 different hands, months apart, with no note anywhere indicating that anyone had asked what she was carrying or opened that plastic folder. Not even once, not even long enough to glance inside before closing it again. August read those 4 pages for a very long time. Delphine waited, and she watched him begin again from the first entry, reading every word more slowly this time, his finger resting on each line like a man following a thread through the dark. Then he looked up, and she saw something on his face that she had never seen in 19 years. It wasn't anger, it was something quieter, and far worse. For the past 6 weeks, he had sat in rooms filled with people and listened as they told him that no one had found the cause. He had paid one team to fly in from Chicago. He had paid another to come from across the ocean. He had approved every expense in the belief that the problem was simply too difficult, and that no one skilled enough had yet found the answer. He had been wrong. The answer had never been difficult. 4 times, the answer had walked to his gate, stood there beneath the rain or the sun, holding the solution in both hands. And 4 times, it had been sent away. $31 million hadn't been lost because no one knew how to fix the problem. It had been lost because no one had been willing to open that plastic folder. He told Delphine to bring all 4 guards upstairs. She asked whether he wanted her to prepare any decision, and he said no. The 4 security guards arrived early that afternoon and stood in a line inside his office. All 4 had already guessed that this concerned the logbooks, because news moved through a harbor faster than anything transported across it. No one was invited to sit. August didn't mention a single name, didn't refer to a single date, and didn't read aloud one line from the 4 logbooks lying on his desk. He simply rose, picked up Marlo Brennan's plastic folder, walked along the line, and placed it in front of the first man. "Open it," he said. The man looked at him, then looked down, then reached out, peeled away the aging tape, and opened the folder. Inside was the drawing. August let him study it for a few seconds, then took the folder, closed it, and carried it to the second man. He repeated those words 3 more times. "Open it, open it, open it." 4 men, 4 times peeling away the tape, 4 times looking down at the same sheet of paper. When the last man had finished opening it, August picked up the plastic folder, stood at the head of the line, and spoke exactly 1 sentence. "Now you've opened it." The 4 times before, how long would it have taken? No one answered. It wasn't because they didn't want to, but because that exact number had appeared in every one of their minds, and it was so small that none of them dared speak it aloud. August said nothing more. He didn't mention consequences, didn't mention disciplinary action, and didn't mention what any of them might lose. He simply told them to return to work. The 4 men walked out into the hallway in silence, and within the following week, all 4 submitted their resignations. The person who ruined the following morning was an attorney named Ruth Ann Pike, head of legal affairs at Whitlock Marine. and she entered the conference room wearing the expression of someone who had finished reading the documents sometime during the night and had been unable to sleep afterward. She didn't sit down. She placed the suspension letter on the table, turned it toward everyone, and read the second paragraph aloud. The paragraph that until then no one in the company had truly examined closely because they had all been too busy searching for the censor. "Conditional suspension," she said. "And conditional is the word that kills us. The condition here is that throughout the entire inspection period, the facility must remain continuously operational and demonstrate an uninterrupted ability to preserve the stored cargo." She placed her finger on one line. "If the cold storage bay stops operating, even once, for any reason whatsoever, including repairs, including repairing the very thing they're inspecting, then under this document, we're automatically deemed incapable of meeting the required standard. We won't be fined. We won't be given an extension. We lose it entirely, permanently, and there is no process for reapplying once a facility has had its license revoked for that reason." The room remained silent for quite some time. Then someone at the far end of the table said what everyone was thinking, that this meant they knew where the fault was, knew exactly what had to be done to correct it, and weren't permitted to do it. Corbin Ashgrove spoke, and this time his voice no longer carried the pleasant manner it had possessed during their earlier meeting. He said that relocating a pressure sensor on the return line required isolating that section of pipe, releasing the pressure, removing the sensing head from its old position, and welding the threaded fitting into a new one. And every part of that work required shutting down the system. He said he had been doing this work for 15 years and had never heard of anyone in the industry working on a pressurized return line. He didn't say it was difficult. He said no one did it. Marlo Brennan sat at the opposite end of the table, still wearing the same gray wool coat, and she hadn't spoken for 20 minutes. She listened to everything. Then she said exactly one sentence. "There is an opening. I know where it is." Every head in the room turned toward her. She pulled the sheet of scrap paper in front of her closer, picked up a pencil, and drew a straight horizontal line. She marked 2 points some distance apart along that line. "This is when the compressor starts," she said, "and this is when it starts again. Between these 2 points, the return line carries no load. The pressure drops to its lowest level in the entire cycle and remains there for a short interval before the controller calls the compressor back on. During that interval, and only during that interval, the sensing head can be removed without isolating anything, because that section of pipe is almost breathing out." She set down the pencil. "It isn't long, but it's enough." Ruth Ann Pike asked how much time they would have, and Marlo gave her a number. Corbin immediately said that figure appeared nowhere in the manufacturer's technical documents, nowhere in the operating logs, and nowhere in any report submitted by the 3 consulting firms. He asked where she had gotten it. Marlo didn't offer a lengthy answer. She simply said, "It hasn't been recorded anywhere, and that is why you don't have it." August Whitlock rose from his chair and walked to the window, turning his back on the entire room. He stood there for a while. He was calculating, though not the engineering, but what he would lose if this woman was wrong, and what he was certain to lose if no one did anything. When he turned around, he didn't look at Corbin or at his attorney. He looked directly at Marlo. 3 nights, he said. "You have 3 nights. Full access to Bay B4, full authority to request personnel and equipment, and no one is to stop you at any door in this facility, including the people sitting in this room." He paused. "If the temperature hasn't stabilized by the end of the 3rd night, I will stop this and find another way, and you will leave." Everyone in the room waited for her to say thank you. That was the scene every person sitting there had automatically pictured in their mind. The woman in the coat with patched elbows rising to thank the man who had just given her a chance. Marlo didn't thank him. She straightened in her chair, folded the scrap paper in half, and asked only one question. "Will I be paid for those 3 nights?" Someone at the far end of the table drew in a sharp breath. Corbin Ashgrove's head snapped up. Delphine Okonjo, standing beside the door with a stack of files in her hands, lowered her face so no one could see her expression. August Whitlock stood motionless and looked at Marlo for exactly 3 beats of the clock, and then he did something no one in that room had ever seen him do. He nodded, and he said, "Yes, at a chief engineer's rate, beginning tonight, with all 3 nights paid in full regardless of the outcome." Before beginning anything, Marlo demanded to see the complete purchasing and installation records for Baby 4, and she made that demand for one very simple reason. If one piece of equipment had been installed in the wrong place, she needed to know who had installed it, when it had been installed, and how many other devices had been installed by that same person. Delphine brought up an entire cardboard box filled with documents. They spread everything across the long table in the small conference room on the 18th floor. 3 hardcover binders, 2 stacks of large rolled drawings, and a pair of acceptance files each as thick as a man's hand. Marlowe pulled the top binder toward her and opened the cover, and she didn't need to turn a single page. The name was right there, in the upper right corner of the first page, printed on the letterhead beside the logo she had seen every day for 4 straight years, the logo that had once appeared on her access badge, on the coffee mug that sat on her desk, and on the anti-static jacket hanging inside the locker bearing her name. She didn't flinch, her hand didn't tremble. She simply stood there and stared at that page longer than she needed to read it, and Delphine, standing 2 steps away, understood that something had just happened, but had no idea what it was. Marlowe turned to the second page, the installation crew roster. She skimmed the lines and recognized 3 names. 3 people who had once sat with her every Monday morning in a conference room with windows overlooking a parking lot in Portland. She turned another page. Acceptance records, signatures, dates. The date on that page was exactly 4 months before the day she received the letter informing her that the company was restructuring. 4 months. That meant that while she had been sitting in a law office rented by the hour, counting what remained in her bank account and listening to someone explain the cost of an independent expert assessment, that same engineering team had been standing inside a cold storage bay in Seattle, bolting a pressure sensor into the exact position she had spent 3 pages warning them never to use. The same margin of error, the same mechanism she had drawn on a whiteboard before 4 managers, only to be told that the figure fell within acceptable limits. The same way they had handled it afterward, not through an engineering debate, but through a meeting with human resources and a politely worded letter. Marlowe closed the binder. She said nothing. She pushed back her chair, walked past Delphine, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. She kept walking until she reached the emergency stairwell at the far end of the floor, pushed open the steel door, and stood inside that cold concrete space with both hands resting on the railing. She remained there for a long time. No one followed her. When she returned to the conference room, August Whitlock was there, standing beside the table and looking down at the open file, while Delphine had gone outside. He asked whether she was all right. Marlowe didn't answer that question. She walked to the table, placed 1 finger on the logo in the corner of the page, and spoke the company's name aloud. Then she said, "I worked here for 4 years. I was the person who wrote the internal report about the pressure sensor error on this equipment line. I presented it in March of that year. They gave me 15 minutes, asked me 2 questions, and told me that the margin fell within acceptable limits. I wrote it again and sent it 1 level higher. 4 weeks later, I was invited into a conference room, and the person sitting across from me wasn't an engineer. It was someone from human resources." She lifted her hand from the page. "Then I sued. I lost. Not because I was wrong, but because I didn't have enough money to see it through to the end. And they had enough money to see it through 3 times. For the past 3 years, I've sent out applications, and no one has called me back. And now I understand why it felt so familiar the first time I lay there, listening to the rhythm of this compressor. It was because I'd heard it before. I heard it inside my head for 4 straight months before they escorted me out of that building." August didn't interrupt her once. Marlowe raised her eyes to him, and her voice remained as calm as it always was, except that this time it carried the calmness of something that had been held under pressure for far too long. "You didn't hire me to repair your warehouse," she said. "You hired me to correct the very mistake I tried to prevent 3 years ago, when the whole world told me to shut up. You're paying me to do over again what I should have been allowed to finish the first time. If only one person had been willing to listen." The room fell silent. August Whitlock looked down at the file on the table, the file his company had approved, paid for, archived, and never read again in 4 years. Then he raised his head and said, "Then we begin tonight." The first trouble arrived before Marlowe even had time to change into protective gear. Delphine took the request, granting access to Baby 4 down to the engineering department for a signature, and the paper returned to her desk 2 hours later, with a handwritten note in the margin stating that granting authority to work on a live system to someone without a valid professional license was inconsistent with internal safety procedures, and recommending that the matter be referred to the engineering board for review at its next meeting. The next meeting was the following week. Marlowe had only 3 nights. Delphine didn't send a written reply. She walked down 2 floors and pushed open the door to Corbin Ashgrove's office. She placed the paper on his desk, and she didn't sit down. She said the chairman had given his verbal authorization in front of more than a dozen people, that she didn't need a board meeting, and that all she needed was one signature. Corbin said that if anything happened inside the cold storage bay that night, the person whose name appeared on that paper would be the one required to answer for it, not the person who had spoken aloud in the conference room. Delphine nodded, then opened the file she had brought with her and placed another document on his desk, the contractor acceptance report from 2019. She said nothing. She simply left it lying there, turned toward him, with his own signature on the final line. Corbin looked down. Then she turned one more page, to the appendix and the reviewer's notes, and there, handwritten in that same script, were 2 lines requesting that the contractor explain why the installation position differed from the design drawing, followed by a question mark. Beneath those 2 lines, in different ink, was the response from the man who had been his superior at the time, brief and direct, stating that the contractor had confirmed the installation met requirements, recommending that the file be closed, and advising against further delay to the acceptance schedule. Delphine allowed the silence to stretch between them. "You saw it," she said at last. 7 years ago, you saw it, and you wrote it down." Corbin didn't deny it. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the surface of the desk, and when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the composure that everyone in that building was accustomed to hearing. He said that he had written it down and sent it upstairs, and that 3 weeks later he had been summoned to the executive floor, where someone had explained to him very gently how delays in the acceptance schedule affected the cash flow for the entire quarter, and how a man his age ought to know which battles were worth fighting. He said he had closed the file, and that in the 7 years since then, he hadn't written another question mark on any report, and his career had advanced with remarkable steadiness. Delphine asked why he had blocked this request. Corbin didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the harbor below, where the cranes stood in a long row, and then he said that the woman had done the very thing he hadn't dared to do, and she had paid for it with 3 years of sleeping on the street. He said that for the past 7 years, he had been able to live with himself only because he believed that if he hadn't remained silent that day, everything would have ended in exactly the same way, except that it would have ended with him. He said that if she failed during these 3 nights, the world would still follow the same order he had arranged inside his mind 7 years earlier, and he would still be able to sleep. Delphine picked up the request and pushed it toward him again, along with the pen. Corbin stared at it for a very long time. Then he picked up the pen and signed, slowly, 1 stroke at a time, like a man dismantling with his own hands something he had built and sheltered inside for many years. The first night began with preparation, and preparation meant drawing. Marlowe needed an operational diagram large enough for the entire crew to see at once, and she needed wide-format paper, something that couldn't be found in any room on the lower floors. Delphine took her up to the 22nd floor, opened the door to August's office, told her that he was meeting with his attorney in the adjoining room and that the drawing paper was in a desk drawer, then was called away to take a phone call. Marlowe remained alone in that room. She pulled open the top drawer. There was nothing inside except pens and a box of paper clips. She opened the second drawer. There was no drawing paper inside. Instead, there was a thin gray folder with no label on the outside, and if she had left it where it was and closed the drawer, the rest of that night might have unfolded differently. But she picked it up. The first photograph fell out when she opened the cover. It had been taken from a distance, and at a slight angle, with the unmistakable quality of a camera fitted with a long lens. The image showed the narrow space between 2 walls behind the substation, the sheet of cardboard laid across the ground, the cart positioned as a barrier at the entrance, and a woman sitting with her back against the concrete and her knees drawn up. Marlowe turned to the next one. The second photograph showed her pushing merchandise into the recycling station. The third showed her at the bus stop, holding a plastic container of food. Beneath them were copies of documents, weight receipts from the Soto station, duplicated across several pages, some with dates circled. The complete file from the civil lawsuit in Portland, containing far more than Corbin had read aloud in the conference room that day. A copy of her employment termination notice, something she had kept only 1 copy of inside the plastic folder and had never given to anyone. And on the inside cover, in the upper left corner, was a handwritten note in the bold, decisive strokes of someone who pressed heavily with an ink pen. "Woman by the wall. Investigate. Possibly sent by Vance." Beneath those words was a date. Marlowe read it. Then she read it again. It was exactly 7 months before the morning her cart overturned outside the gate. The door opened. August Whitlock entered with a stack of documents in his hands and stopped in the middle of the room when he saw what lay open on his desk. Marlo didn't ask him what it was. She picked up the file and threw it down onto the wooden desk. Not hard, but with enough force to send the photograph sliding out and spreading like a fan across the walnut surface. 7 months, she said. You knew 7 months ago that I was sleeping there. You knew my name. You knew where I used to work, whom I sued, and the date I lost the case. You had photographs of the place where I slept. She pointed to the handwritten note on the inside cover. And what did you do with all of that? You wrote down that someone needed to investigate whether I'd been sent by someone else. She straightened. You never saw me, she said. You were only checking to see whether I was dangerous to you. Every morning, you passed that place on your way through the gate. 7 months. And in all those 7 months, the only question this building ever asked about me was whom I worked for. Not who I was, not what I knew, only whether I might cause trouble for you. August didn't interrupt her. He placed the documents he was carrying on a chair, walked to the desk, and looked down at the photographs spread across it. He didn't gather them up. He didn't tell her that she had misunderstood. He didn't explain that the year before, he had lost $43 million because he had trusted the wrong person, that ever since then, anyone who remained too long within roughly 656 feet of his warehouse complex had become the subject of a file just like this one, or that the cabinet behind him contained more than 30 others. All of those things were true, and none of them made what he had done any different. You're right, he said. He raised his eyes to her. 7 months ago, I knew there was a person sleeping behind my substation. I had every resource necessary to find out who you were within 2 days, and that is exactly what I did. Then I read the conclusion, saw that you had no connection to anyone I needed to guard against, closed this file, and put it in the drawer. He rested one finger against the edge of the gray folder. That is the worst part, he said. Not that I had someone follow you. It is that after I knew who you were, I still closed the file. I had the name of your school, your field of study, and the report you wrote in Portland, and the only conclusion I drew from any of it was that you weren't dangerous. Then I moved on. He fell silent for a long time. 3 engineering teams, $31 million, 6 weeks, he said. The answer has been sitting in this drawer for 7 months, and I'm the one who put it there. You can blame the 4 guards outside the gate if you want, but all they failed to do was open a plastic folder. I opened it, and I still saw nothing. Marlo stood there, her hands still clenched, and she said nothing more. Beyond the window, far below, the harbor lights had come on for the night shift. Ellery Vance arrived the following morning without an appointment, and the receptionist called upstairs in the voice of someone who wasn't sure whether she should be calling at all. August told her to send him up. At 61, wearing a gray wool coat and holding a felt hat in one hand, Vance entered the room with the ease of a man who had walked into it several thousand times and knew precisely which chair would creak when pulled out. He didn't offer his hand. He placed a cedar box on the desk, as long as a man's forearm, its 4 corners capped with tarnished brass, and 2 initials carved into the lid, and he said nothing about it. 10 years earlier, August had bought that box from a shop in Pike Place Market, wrapped it, and given it to the man who had taught him how to read a contract from the last line back to the first. Now it rested on the desk, its lid closed, without explanation. There are ways for one man to say that everything between us is over, and this was the quietest of them all. Vance sat down. He spoke of business immediately, without preamble, saying that he had come with an offer and wanted to put it on the table before anyone had time to call an attorney into the room. A group in Vancouver was prepared to purchase the entirety of Whitlock Marine's licensed operations, including the entire cold storage complex and the pharmaceutical warehousing rights, for a figure he wrote on the back of a business card and slid across the desk. August didn't look at the card. Vance continued, saying there was one condition. Before the transfer could be completed, August had to voluntarily submit a statement to the regulatory authority acknowledging that the company lacked the capacity to maintain continuous operations and requesting that control be transferred to a more capable operator. August asked why such a statement was necessary when the money was already enough to buy everything. Vance said that money could buy the port, but only that piece of paper could take the name. Then he leaned back in his chair and said what he had truly come there to say. "You still think I betrayed you," he said. "I don't. I've watched you since you were 20, and I know where you're going. One step at a time, year after year, you're becoming the very man you swore to me in my kitchen that you would never become. I didn't betray you. August. I simply stopped before you could turn me into part of it. August sat perfectly still. Then he asked a question he hadn't intended to ask when that morning began. What do you know about my father that you've never told me? The question fell between them and remained there. Ellery Vance didn't answer immediately. He didn't shake his head, wave it away, or ask what that had to do with anything. He simply sat in silence, his eyes lowered to the desk, and inside that room, the pause lasted exactly 1 beat longer than an ordinary question deserved. 1 beat, only one. But August Whitlock had spent 15 years sitting across from this man. He had learned from him how to read contracts, and he had learned that wherever someone hesitated during a negotiation, something lay buried there that was worth digging up. Vance rose to his feet. He said the offer would remain valid for 10 days, that the figure would change after that, and that August knew how to reach him. He put on his hat, walked to the door, and paused there for half a second without turning around before opening it and stepping out. The cedar box remained untouched on the desk. August didn't reach for it. He sat there for a long time after the door had closed. And what stayed lodged in his mind wasn't the figure written on the business card, the group in Vancouver, or the name he was about to lose. It was a silence that had lasted 1 beat longer than it should have. He picked up the telephone and called Delphine Okonjo, then told her to retrieve every record concerning the contractor company from 2019, not the technical files, but the corporate records, the business registrations, the founding shareholders, and everything else that still existed, including anything that had been moved into storage long ago. It took Delphine Okonjo 2 days to pull every one of those records out of the basement archives, and she didn't do it out of curiosity. Ruth Ann Pike had told her that if the matter went to a hearing, the legal team would need to prove that the fault lay with the contractor, not the developer, and to do that, they would have to reconstruct the entire history of the company that had installed the sensor, from the day it was founded to the day it was dissolved. She worked throughout Monday afternoon in a small conference room with 3 open cardboard boxes, arranging everything chronologically and writing notes in a yellow notebook. Near evening, she found something she believed might be a useful lead. The contractor qualification file contained a section listing the contracts the company had completed, and on the 3rd page of that section, among a series of industrial client names, there was a line stating that the company had once maintained the emergency power systems for the Georgetown infrastructure complex under a contract that had lasted several years and ended 15 years earlier. Delphine read the line twice. She didn't live in Georgetown, and she knew nothing about the area except that it lay south of the city. What caught her attention was entirely professional. A company that specialized in emergency electrical maintenance had taken on the installation of an industrial refrigeration system, and that expansion beyond its usual field was something the legal team might be able to use. She marked the page with a yellow slip of paper, attached the company registration behind it, and carried the entire file up to the 22nd floor. August was standing by the window when she entered. She placed the file on his desk, already open to the page marked by the yellow paper, and told him she believed she had found something the attorneys should investigate more deeply. She mentioned the Georgetown complex, speaking its name the way people speak the name of a location found in a file. He turned around. He walked to the desk and bent over the page. Delphine waited, prepared to explain further about the company's authorized scope of work and Ruth Ann's intended argument, but he didn't ask her a single question. He read the line, turned to the next page, then turned another, and she realized that he was no longer reading in order. He was searching for something specific. He flipped to the final section of the file, the corporate registration records, and there he found a page listing the founding shareholders at the time the company had been established. 11 names arranged alphabetically, each on a separate line with its corresponding ownership percentage. He read from top to bottom. When he reached the 9th line, he stopped. Delphine saw his hand resting against the edge of the paper, and she saw that it no longer moved. She didn't ask. She had worked beside this man for 19 years, and she knew there were moments when the right thing to do was remain still and say nothing at all. The name on the 9th line was his father's. It wasn't a similar name. It wasn't a shared surname, the kind of coincidence that often appeared in old records. It was his father's full name, accompanied by a registered address, and that address belonged to the house where August had grown up. The ownership percentage beside it wasn't large. It was small enough to escape notice, yet large enough to earn a seat in the meetings where people decided which expenses to cut in order to preserve the following quarter's profits. August straightened. He walked to the window, returned to the desk, then went back to the window again, and Delphine had never seen him pace that room before. Then he told her to retrieve every surviving set of shareholder meeting minutes from that company, covering the period from 16 to 14 years earlier, and to make the collection as complete as possible. She brought them to him the following morning. He read all day. What he found was buried inside a thin set of minutes, dated in the autumn of that year, from a routine meeting, under the fourth item on the agenda, titled Service Contract Cost Review. The record stated that to preserve the planned profit margin, the board had unanimously agreed to reduce the frequency of scheduled inspections for emergency power clusters classified as low priority, changing them from monthly inspections to inspections performed only when requested, with a corresponding reduction in maintenance labor costs. The list of low-priority clusters was attached as an appendix. The Georgetown Emergency Power Cluster was on that list. Beneath the resolution was a list of the members who had voted in favor, the ninth line. 15 years earlier, on a rainy night near the end of October, all of Georgetown lost power, and in the darkness, the emergency system failed to start. The nearest emergency clinic switched to restricted intake. 16-year-old Rosalind Whitlock suffered an asthma attack in the middle of the night. Her inhaler in the drawer had run out the day before, and her 19-year-old brother carried her on his back for more than 2 miles through the rain because help couldn't reach them in time, and he couldn't think of anything else to do. He would always remember the lights of the emergency clinic appearing at the bottom of the hill, white and glaring, and the feeling of his sister's hands loosening around his neck during the final 20 steps. She didn't survive the night. For the next 15 years, August Whitlock built everything he possessed upon a single belief: that the world left people to die in the darkness, and that the only way to avoid being abandoned was to become so powerful that he never needed anyone's permission. He had signed every contract with that belief inside him. He had severed every relationship because of that belief. He had become the man whom everyone at the port was afraid to call by name because of that belief. And now the truth lay on his desk, printed on yellowed paper. The darkness that night hadn't come from some distant, unknowable world. It had come from an item on an agenda, a line of expenses crossed out, and a vote of approval on the 9th line. He lowered himself into his chair. On the wall behind him, the second hand continued moving steadily across the marks on the clock. Then he thought of Ellery Vance, the man who had served as his father's private attorney before becoming his advisor, the man who had sat in those meeting rooms, the man who had held the keys to these archives for years, and the man who, only yesterday, had remained silent for precisely 1 beat too long when asked a very simple question. He had known. He had known for 15 years. He sat in that room until darkness had fallen completely, without turning on the lights, calling anyone, or touching the open file on the desk. Delphine stopped by once, saw him sitting in the shadows, and quietly closed the door again. By the time he rose, the harbor district beyond the window was glowing with the lights of the night shift, the cranes standing in rows as they did every other night, the water black and still, as though nothing had changed at all in the past 15 years. He picked up his coat. He didn't say a word to anyone about what he had just read. He simply went downstairs to the car, told the driver to take him to Terminal 18, and throughout the entire journey, he didn't look out the window even once. The third night began at the shift change. Bay B4 had to remain at -18 degrees Celsius, and wasn't permitted to stray from that temperature for even a moment, so all the work had to be performed inside, with the bay door left open only wide enough for one person to pass through, and a thick plastic curtain hanging behind it to hold in the cold. Marlowe wore the cold protection suit used by the warehouse workers, and 2 pairs of gloves, but she had removed the outer pair at the very beginning because no one could turn a clamp while wearing gloves that thick. Beside her were 2 mechanics, one holding a light and the other holding the tools. 3 steps away, Corbin Ashgrove stood with a clipboard in one hand and a stopwatch in the other, and he wasn't there because anyone had asked him to be. The procedure had been mapped out that afternoon. Marlowe wasn't allowed to remove the entire assembly at once. She had to divide the work into several rounds, accomplishing only a very small part during each one, and every round could take place only within that brief interval when the return line carried no load. The interval she had drawn on a sheet of scrap paper in the conference room, and that no one had found in any document. The method of recognizing it had also come from her. There was no instrument to tell them when it began. She placed her bare palm against the pipe and waited. When she lowered her hand, the entire crew began working. When she raised it, everyone stopped and withdrew their tools from the work area. During the first round, they removed the insulation. During the second, they loosened the upper clamp. By the 4th round, Marlowe's hands had begun to stiffen, and before touching the pipe each time, she had to press her palms together and breathe warm air between them, because if her hands weren't sensitive enough, she couldn't feel the moment the interval began. Corbin recorded every round, every time, and every movement, and around midnight, he remarked to the mechanic beside him, without addressing anyone in particular, that the deviation between rounds was less than 1/10 of a second. Outside, in the underground parking garage beneath the harbor offices, 3 men stood waiting beside the emergency power cabinet for the warehouse complex. They cut the backup power shortly before midnight, and before they could leave, August Whitlock emerged from the stairwell. He walked toward them alone, without calling security or reaching for his telephone. What happened next was brief and unfolded very quickly, and he didn't raise his hands to defend himself. When it was over, he straightened, touched the back of his hand to the corner of his mouth, then lowered it and began to speak. He recited the first man's full name, followed by the name of the street where he lived. He recited the second man's name and street, then the third man's. He spoke slowly, without emphasis, as though reading from an inventory list. No one answered. The man nearest to him stepped back half a pace. Then all 3 turned and walked toward the exit, and none of them looked back. August remained alone in the parking garage, pulled the lever on the electrical cabinet back into its original position, then went upstairs. Inside the cold storage bay, the lights flickered once and came back on, and Marlowe didn't ask why. She had reached the final round. The sensor had been moved to its new position 4 inches from the discharge valve. The threaded base was seated, and all that remained was to tighten it to the required torque and secure the clamp. It was the round that required the most time, and it was also the one she had deliberately saved for last, because she knew she would have strength enough for only one more attempt. She placed her hand on the pipe, waited, lowered her hand. She tightened. The mechanic holding the light asked whether she wanted someone to relieve her, and she shook her head because shaking it required less strength than speaking. She continued tightening. By the final turn, she could no longer feel the wrench handle in her hand. She could feel only her shoulder and neck, while somewhere far away, something had begun to hum inside her ears. She secured the clamp. She pulled her hand out of the work area, raised it to signal that they were finished, and had just enough time to see the mechanic holding the light turn toward her. Then the floor tilted beneath her. They carried her outside in less than a minute. Corbin Ashgrove was the one who threw down his clipboard and caught her before she struck the floor, and he was the one who shouted for medical assistance. The harbor medical room was located in the building across the way. It was heated, supplied with blankets, and furnished with an old leather examination chair. They warmed her, checked her body temperature 3 times, and the physician on duty said she had remained below a safe temperature for quite some time, and that if she had attempted one more round, the outcome would have been different. Marlowe regained consciousness about 20 minutes later. Delphine Okonjo was sitting in the chair beside her. August Whitlock stood at the foot of the bed, still wearing his coat. Marlowe opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling, and the first thing she said wasn't a question about where she was or whether she was all right. She asked whether the data had been recorded. Delphine leaned closer, so Marlowe wouldn't have to speak loudly. She told her that the recorder had been running continuously from the moment the clamp was secured. She said the compressor cycle had returned to its intended rhythm from the very first startup afterward. Then she said the words that no one in that entire building had been able to say for 6 weeks. The temperature inside the bay was holding steady. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't fluctuating. It had remained perfectly still from that moment until now. Marlowe lay motionless. She didn't smile or say anything more. She simply closed her eyes, and Delphine watched as Marlowe's hands, which had been gripping the edge of the blanket, slowly loosened their hold. The article appeared online on Friday morning, 2 days after that night, on a local business news site that no one at Whitlock Marine had ever paid any attention to. It didn't mention the sensor. It didn't mention that the temperature in Bay B4 had remained perfectly still for 48 hours. It devoted nearly all its space to one woman, describing her as an employee of unclear background, then listing the case number of her lawsuit in Portland, the date the court issued its ruling, the phrase termination of employment, and 3 years with no recorded work history. In its final paragraph, it asked whether a corporation whose license had been suspended should entrust a system worth tens of millions of dollars to someone like her. There was no author's name. When Ruth Ann Pike finished reading it, she immediately said that the information couldn't have come from a public search. Someone had to have pulled it from internal records, and she named the group in Vancouver before anyone had time to ask. Marlowe didn't read the article on a company computer. She read it on her old telephone at the bus stop, then turned off the screen and walked back to St. Anselm Shelter. She hadn't slept there in months, but she still had something stored there. Sister Bernadette greeted her at the door as though she were welcoming someone who returned regularly. She asked no questions and didn't mention the article, even though she was 67 years old and knew everything that happened in that neighborhood before it happened. She simply led Marlowe down to the basement, opened the storage locker, and took out a cardboard box with one corner crushed, tied with string, lighter than it looked. The two of them carried it into the back courtyard, where there was a wooden bench and an old metal barrel in which people lit fires every winter. Marlowe opened the box. Inside were letters. They stood upright, their folded edges facing upward, packed tightly together, most of them still bearing the creases left by window envelopes. She had counted them once during the second year and had never counted them again. 217 letters. Some were 3 paragraphs long, some contained only a single line, and some had come from companies that no longer existed. Sister Bernadette looked at the box, then at her, and asked why she had kept them. Marlowe didn't need long to think. "To remember that I once tried," she said. Sister Bernadette nodded. She lifted the box with both hands, walked to the metal barrel, and emptied every sheet of paper into it. She did it without haste and without asking anyone's permission. She struck a match, dropped it in, and stepped back. The flames caught first along the edges of the paper, traveled through the folds, then flared upward, casting an orange glow across the brick wall behind them. Marlowe stood watching. For nearly a minute, she did nothing. Then she stepped forward, reached into the edge of the barrel, and pulled out an envelope that had begun to burn at one corner. She slapped it against the leg of her pants until the flame went out. That envelope was thicker than the others. It wasn't a rejection letter. It was an offer of employment from a research institute in Corvallis, dated 3 years earlier, clearly stating the position, the salary, and the expected starting date. It had been sent exactly 2 days before the records of her lawsuit were entered into the court's public system. 7 days later, she received a brief telephone call saying that the position had been revised in the staffing plan and that they were very sorry. She had kept that letter for 3 years, not because it hurt, but because it was the only piece of paper in the world proving that there had once been a place that read her resume and said yes. She stood there holding it in her hand, the edge of the paper still warm, one corner scorched black. Sister Bernadette looked at the letter, then at her, and said only one thing. "Then you try for the 218th time." The fire inside the metal barrel burned a little longer before slowly dying away. The two women stood beside each other in the courtyard until nothing remained but ashes and a few glowing red embers, and neither of them said another word. The hearing opened on Tuesday morning in a Port Authority Commission conference room with pale wood-paneled walls, 5 commissioners seated on the dais, and Ellery Vance, sitting with 2 attorneys in the row, reserved for interested parties. He didn't need to say much. He merely had to submit 4 sets of damaged goods inventory records, 4 independent inspection reports, and a consolidated statement of losses, then leave them lying there. His argument was concise to the point of cruelty. In 6 weeks, a pharmaceutical storage facility had allowed its inventory to become completely worthless 4 times. The current management had hired experts on 3 separate occasions and failed on all 3, and a facility like that shouldn't be permitted to retain its license merely because it belonged to a name that had been present at this harbor for 3 generations. One commissioner asked whether Whitlock Marine wished to respond. Ruth Ann Pike rose and said that her side requested permission to call someone to make a presentation. Marlowe Brennan walked to the front, carrying a slim briefcase. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore the same gray wool coat, its elbows still patched with dark brown thread, and at least 2 people on the dais glanced down at it before looking back up. She said she wouldn't be presenting evidence. She said she had brought a map, and that the evidence had already been sitting somewhere else for the past 4 years. No one had ever gone looking for it. She placed a small projector on the table and turned it on. On the left side of the screen were photographs of pages from a handwritten notebook, filled with small printed letters arranged in columns. She briefly explained that it was her personal log from the past 11 months, 1 line for every day, and that in the final column of each line she had used a symbol of her own devising to mark the nights when the compressor cycle in Bay B4 had fallen out of rhythm. A murmur moved across the dais. One commissioner asked her directly whether she understood that a handwritten notebook had no evidentiary value. Marlowe said she did, and that this was precisely why she had called it a map. Then she switched to the second image. On the right side of the screen was a chart showing electricity consumption at the distribution station serving the Terminal 18 area, drawn from public data maintained by the Seattle Electric Utility, information anyone had the right to request and no one ever had. She explained that whenever a compressor started outside its normal cycle, it created a very small load spike along the consumption line. The spike was so slight that it disappeared into the noise when an entire year was viewed at once. But if someone already knew which nights to examine, it became unmistakably clear. She superimposed the two images, 340 marks in her notebook and 340 corresponding load spikes on the utility chart, each one on the same date and within the same time window. She left the image on the screen for a moment, then she moved the chart's timeline backward, beyond the period covered by her notebook, and the load spikes continued to appear, less frequently but with steady regularity, extending back through the previous year, then the year before that, until they stopped at the point where they had first begun. That point came nearly 2 years before August Whitlock assumed control of the cold storage complex. The conference room remained silent for a long time. Vance sat perfectly still. One of his 2 attorneys bent down to write something, then stopped. At last, the chair asked Marlowe a question, speaking in the voice of a man still trying to arrange everything properly inside his mind. He asked what she did for a living. Marlowe remained silent for exactly 1 beat. Then she said, "For the past 11 months, I've picked up paper." She looked up at the dais. "And that was the work that kept me an engineer." No one asked another question. The commission announced a recess for deliberations, and everyone moved into the hallway. Ellery Vance stood alone near the window at the far end of the corridor, his 2 attorneys having already gone downstairs. August Whitlock walked toward him with a large envelope tucked beneath his arm. Inside were copies of the shareholder meeting minutes from that year, the voting records, and the complete cross-reference showing who had sat in those rooms as legal counsel. Ruth Ann Pike had told him the previous evening that those documents were enough to end the man's career within a week, and that if they were given to the press, they would end many other things as well. Marlowe passed by, saw the envelope, and stopped. She asked whether he was about to do this because it was right, or because he wanted Vance to suffer. August didn't answer her. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked over to Vance, but he didn't give the envelope to him. He handed it to the commission clerk standing beside the door to the deliberation room, together with a written request that the entire file be forwarded to the state authority responsible for regulating the legal profession. No copies would leave that office. No names would appear in the newspapers. Ellery Vance understood within 3 seconds, and he understood the price as well. He would lose his license to practice law, lose his standing as counsel, and lose everything that could be uncovered with a single search. But his wife wouldn't have to read about it in the newspapers, and his children wouldn't have to answer anyone's questions. He turned to August and asked why. August Whitlock looked at him and said only 1 sentence. "You once told me you were keeping me from becoming my father, and you were wrong, because you didn't, but someone else did." Then he turned away and walked down the corridor, and he didn't look back even once. The commission lifted the suspension at the end of that week, subject to a 6-month period of oversight, and the news traveled throughout the harbor before the official document even reached Ruth Ann Pike's hands. The following Monday, August Whitlock called a small meeting in the conference room on the 18th floor. Delphine Okonjo was there, along with Ruth Ann, Corbin Ashgrove, and Marlowe Brennan. He didn't begin with a word of thanks. He pushed a 3-page document across the table and said it described a position that, until that morning, hadn't existed anywhere in the company's organizational structure: Director of Systems Integrity. Ruth Ann had asked him the day before where he had found the title, and he had answered that he'd invented it because none of the existing titles described the work that needed to be done. According to those 3 pages, that work involved conducting field inspections of every equipment cluster installed during the past 10 years, and comparing each one with its original design drawings, rebuilding the acceptance process, and retaining the authority to order work stopped on any component that didn't match. He said he wasn't giving anyone anything, that this was a real position with a budget and performance targets, and that whoever accepted it would be judged by results just like anyone else. Then he slid the 2nd page toward her, the section containing the contract terms, and asked whether there was anything she wished to discuss. Everyone in the room believed this part would take 3 minutes. Marlowe read the document from beginning to end without skipping a single line. She asked 2 questions about the scope of the facilities subject to inspection, and one about the budget for measuring equipment. Ruth Ann answered all 3. Then Marlowe turned back to the 2nd page, placed her finger at the end of the terms, where 10 numbered provisions appeared, and said she needed 1 more. She read it aloud, slowly, as though dictating every word. "The person holding this position shall have the authority to suspend the receipt, storage, or release of any shipment at any Whitlock Marine facility upon discovering a technical deviation that may affect storage conditions. The suspension shall take effect immediately upon issuance. It shall require no prior approval and may not be overturned by anyone at any level of the company, including the chairman. She looked up. Provision 11, she said. I'll still accept the position without it, but you and I both know that the next time I find something that doesn't match the drawings, someone somewhere in this building will explain the schedule and the quarter's cash flow to me. Ruth Ann Pike set down her pen. Corbin Ashgrove didn't look up. Delphine Okonjo, standing beside the door as she always did, straightened. No one in the room said anything, because they had all just heard a woman who had been offered a job demand a degree of authority that had never been granted to anyone in the company's history, and she had demanded it in the voice of someone reading technical specifications. August Whitlock looked down at the paper before him. He didn't ask Ruth Ann. He didn't turn toward Delphine. He sat motionless for nearly 10 seconds, then raised his head and said, "Read me that last sentence again." The room went dead silent. Delphine Okonjo had stood beside that door for 19 years, and she knew exactly what she had just heard. There was an unwritten rule at that harbor that Mr. Whitlock asked only once, and anyone who made him ask a second time understood that they wouldn't be there much longer. In 19 years, she had never seen him ask again. Corbin Ashgrove's head snapped up. Ruth Ann Pike looked toward Delphine, but Delphine didn't return her gaze. Marlo Brennan knew nothing about that rule. She simply lowered her eyes to the paper and read the final sentence again, a little more slowly than before, without adding a single word. It shall require no prior approval and may not be overturned by anyone at any level of the company, including the chairman. August picked up his pen. By hand, he added Provision 11 at the bottom of the page, word for word, without changing a thing. Then he signed beneath it and pushed the paper toward her. He told Ruth Ann to have the official version typed that day, with the wording preserved exactly, and that if the legal department had any objections, they could bring them directly to him. Then he rose and left the room. Marlo remained seated with the paper in her hands. 3 years earlier, in another conference room in another city, she had spoken a truth, and they had taken away her right to speak it. Now that right lay before her, written by hand on the final line of the second page, bearing a signature. The apartment was on the second floor of an old building in Ballard, with 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors worn smooth along the walkway, and a kitchen so small that anyone opening the refrigerator had to take a step back. Marlo signed the lease on a Thursday afternoon, and it took another 10 days to finish the paperwork, buy the beds, and repaint one wall the landlord had agreed to let her paint. Thea Brennan drove up from Tacoma on Saturday morning, and Junie sat in the back seat with a backpack on her lap and a shoebox filled with the things she considered important. She ran up the stairs ahead of everyone else. She crossed the living room, passed through the kitchen, pushed open the door to the first bedroom, then the second, and in the second room, she stopped. The room had a window facing the back, and beyond that window stood a large maple tree in the neighbor's yard, its branches reaching across the fence, its leaves beginning to change color. Junie gazed outside for a while, then turned around, planted both hands on her hips, and announced to the entire apartment that her desk would go right there beside the window, facing out, because from that spot she could see the tree. She went on to explain that if they put the desk against the opposite wall, all she would be able to see was a wall, and looking at a wall didn't help anyone study. Thea laughed. Junie didn't, because she was entirely serious, and she began pacing around the room to decide where the bookcase should go. Then she ran out to the balcony before racing into the kitchen to ask which cabinet would hold the snacks. For the next half hour, Marlo did nothing except follow her daughter and answer questions. Yes, this cabinet was hers. Yes, that drawer could be used for toys. Yes, she could put pictures on the wall. By noon, Thea left, promising to return the following weekend. Junie went out to the balcony and sat down to draw. Marlo walked into her daughter's room, stood in the middle of the empty space among several unopened boxes, then lowered herself to the floor and leaned her back against the foot of the bed. She hadn't cried in 3 years. She hadn't cried in that human resources conference room. She hadn't cried when the attorney called with the outcome. She hadn't cried on the night she dragged her suitcase out of her last apartment, or on that first morning when she stood at the recycling station counting loose change in her palm, or on any of those Sunday afternoons at the park when her little girl waved for the second time from across the street. She sat on the wooden floor in the room with the window overlooking the tree, listening to the soft clatter of crayons on the balcony, and she wept, pressing both hands over her face so no sound would escape. It lasted only a few minutes. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, stood up, and went out to the balcony to ask what Junie was drawing. The following Sunday, Marlo had to stop by the office to pick up a set of survey documents. And because there was no one available to watch Junie, the little girl went with her. The building was nearly empty. The security guard in the lobby nodded in greeting, and Junie called out a very loud hello in return. On the 22nd floor, the carpeted corridor lay silent, and she walked along it with both hands clasped behind her back like someone visiting a museum. The door to August Whitlock's office stood open. He was inside, alone, wearing a dress shirt without a tie and reading something at his desk. Marlo knocked and said she would need only 5 minutes to collect the documents. Junie had already walked into the room. She stood in the middle of the office, looked around, and her eyes settled on the wall clock behind the desk. She studied it for quite some time, long enough for a child of 6 to become certain of what she was about to say. Then she told him that his clock was broken. Marlo turned around. August set down his pen. Junie continued explaining in the helpful tone of someone solving a problem. The long hand was missing, and the long hand was the one that showed the minutes, which meant the clock didn't know what time it was anymore. It only knows the hour, she said. And knowing only the hour isn't enough. August rose from his chair. He walked around the desk, then lowered himself until his eyes were level with hers, resting one hand on his knee. He told her that he knew, and that he liked it that way. Junie received this information with grave seriousness. She didn't ask why. She simply stood there thinking, her head tilted slightly to one side in that particular way children think when they're trying to solve a problem the adults have already abandoned. Then her face brightened. She searched through her coat pocket, pulled out a blue-colored pencil, ran to the desk, tore a note from the stack in the corner, and climbed onto the chair so she would have something to lean against. She carefully drew a long, straight line, tracing over it again and again until it grew dark, then sharpened one end into an arrow. She climbed down, hurried toward the clock, and when she realized she couldn't reach it, she looked up at August. He lifted her into his arms. Junie pressed the note onto the glass covering the clock, smoothed it twice to make sure it stayed in place, then studied her work and adjusted it until it was straight. "There," she said. "You can keep this, but if you don't like it, you can take it off. It isn't very sticky." He lowered her to the floor. Junie ran back to her mother, asked whether she was finished, then raced into the hallway to find out how many footsteps long the carpet was. Marlo held the documents, thanked him, and followed her daughter. Inside that office, August Whitlock stood alone before the wall clock. The yellow note leaned slightly to the right, and on it was a blue minute hand, drawn by a 6-year-old hand, pointing toward an empty space on the glass. He stood there looking at it for a very long time. He didn't take it down. 14 months later, Whitlock Marine announced the Engineer Revival Program, and by the time of its first reporting period, 22 engineers had been hired, all of them people who had once been cast aside by their own industry for speaking a truth at a time when no one wanted to hear it. The number of incidents at the corporation's cold storage complexes fell by 94% compared with the previous year, and on a block south of the city, a small first aid station bearing the name Rosalind Whitlock remained open throughout the night, requiring no appointment and no paperwork, welcoming everyone who walked through its doors. One autumn afternoon, as Marlo Brennan moved her belongings into her new office, Delphine Okonjo helped her unpack the boxes and picked up something lying at the bottom of one of them. It was an old plastic cover with curled edges and layers of peeling tape, something that could no longer serve any practical purpose. She asked Marlo why she still kept it. Marlo took it from her, turned it over, and slipped a finger into the narrow opening between the 2 layers of plastic. Inside was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, softened by time, and when she opened it, she found a picture of a very tall building drawn in gray crayon, with square windows arranged in perfectly even rows and, near the top, a tiny figure with blonde hair raising one hand. During all 11 months it had lain outdoors. The thing she had rushed into the rain to save had never been an engineering drawing. The drawing had merely been stiff enough to serve as an outer cover, protecting the sheet of paper inside from getting wet. There is something this story leaves behind, and it has nothing to do with the cold storage facility or the money that was lost. Society rarely loses talented people because they lack ability. Society loses them because it has taught them that telling the truth is a mistake, that silence is safer, and that there are certain doors they would be better off never knocking on. And the price of silencing an honest person has never ended with that person alone. It always returns, later, and at greater cost, and it often comes knocking on the very door that was closed all those years ago. Every day, we pass someone on the side of the road, at a checkout counter, or in the last row of a conference room, and too often we see only their circumstances without ever seeing the human being within them. Sometimes the most precious thing a person carries is wrapped in the most battered covering, and all they need is someone willing to stop, open it, and ask one compassionate question. If this story made you think of someone who quietly passed through your life without you ever stopping to look closely, please leave a like, share this video with them, and subscribe to our channel so that every day, together, we can hear more stories about the people the world was too quick to overlook. How did Marlo and August's story make you feel? Which moment touched you most deeply? And if you have ever been the person standing outside that door, or the person who forgot to open it, please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health and a life filled with happiness, peace, and gentleness each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.